It is often normal for us as humans to think or indeed believe that suffering is a negative experience which is adverse to our well-being. But is this true always? In this episode, I would like to discuss how societies or communities that have suffered, those that have faced adverse suffering, have actually ended up constructing nations that we so greatly admire today. Let me start with England in the year 997 CE or Common Era. The Roman Empire had fallen, and the Romans had ruled England for more than 500 years. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the English people were left alone. They were abandoned. They faced great suffering. The Romans walked away with their technology in pottery, which was used by the English to store food. With the Romans gone, the English people lived under adverse temperatures, extremely low temperatures. They had nowhere to store their food because the Romans had walked away with their technology. But this did not discourage the English people. They pulled themselves together and endured their suffering for many, many years. In 1625, Charles I became King of England. During his reign, he fomented a dispute between the Crown and Parliament, which dispute ended up in a civil war which lasted 9 years from 1642 to 1651. The dispute, is, if you may wish to know, was on how England should govern Scotland and Ireland. The Civil War again affected the life of the English people. They underwent suffering. Life was hard again, but they endured like they did after the departure of the Romans. By 1914, when the First World War broke out, Britain had become a military power. To the extent that it built up its military, the English people were united in purpose and in identity, that there would be a people under Britain, which now included Wales and Scotland. By 1940, which was the time of the Second World War, when Adolf Hitler attacked Britain, he actually failed to overrun the country. He failed to overrun the British people, like he had done with the French the same year. Britain, in this state, went on to build an empire, which we all know, across the world, which governed a population of about 440 million across the world, including our country, Zambia. But that imperial project included a set of colonies in the Americas, a group or a constellation which is today known as the United States of America. When the Confederate colonies came together to try to establish one nation, the British establishment wanted to exercise control over these colonies, an act which they opposed and resisted. This led to the War of Independence, the American War of Independence in 1775, which ran up to 1776, when America got its independence from Britain. The British left America and left the colonies to fend for themselves. The American people suffered. They had lost lives during the War of Independence. They had nowhere to look to, because the only power that could have come to their aid was Britain, which was now an adversary. So they had to look inwardly. And they decided they were going to forge ahead as a people and rise out of that adverse suffering which they were facing. But that's not the end of the American story. In 1861, the North and the South part of America were divided over the end of slavery. That disagreement led to the American Civil War, which ran from 1861 to 1865 during Abraham Lincoln's first term of office. Many lives were lost during that Civil War. The American economy was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Life was hard for the new colonies that are now established a nation called the United States of America. Lincoln's leadership was tested to try to keep the unity and identity of these colonies as one. But they persevered and they surmounted the obstacles. And they came to construct a nation and score strides economically to establish a country that we so greatly admire today as the United States of America. In 1959, Singapore gained its independence from the British. Singapore was originally part of the territory of mainland Malaysia. It was composed of the Malays and the ethnic Chinese, who suffered great discrimination at the hands of the Malays. When Singapore became independent, the only country closest to them they could trade with was Malaysia. But it was difficult because of that background in the relations between the ethnic Malays and the ethnic Chinese, who had now established a country called Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew, in his book, From the Third World to the First, which I recommend to everybody that is interested in reading, paints a gloomy picture of Singapore during this period. It was a hopeless picture of a country that had no prospects of ever gaining success in establishing a new nation state. In one of his addresses to his people, Lee Kuan Yew said to the Singaporeans, "The world does not owe us a living." He further says, "I was convinced that to succeed, we needed to depend upon ourselves." Two important fundamental principles established by Lee Kuan Yew. The world did not owe Singapore a living, and if Singapore were to succeed, it must depend upon its own people. Singapore had nowhere to look up to other than its own people. Unemployment had risen. The British dockyards had closed, and everybody was suffering. But the Singaporeans managed to come out of this adverse situation. And today, we all know that Singapore's economy is one of the top 10 in the world. In 1939, when the Second World War broke out, the Allied powers composed of Britain, France, the United States, Russia, declared war against Hitler because of his imperial attitude over Europe. At the end of the Second World War in 1945, Germany was left in rubble. But the German people's spirit was not buried under that rubble. Even after paying reparations to the Allies as a punishment for having caused the war, Germany went ahead to show the spirit of unity as a people. They couldn't look up to anybody for the reconstruction of their country because everybody was an adversary. Germany was isolated. But in the last 80 years, Germany has constructed an economy which is leading Europe. And it is third only after the United States and China. So that's another story of a people who have suffered and were able to come out of that suffering and prosper and score great achievements. In 1962, John F. Kennedy signed a proclamation which is known as the Cuban embargo today. The proclamation prohibited any trade relations between the United States and Cuba. The embargo still stands to date. Another interesting point about Cuba is that Cuba is not a member of the IMF and Cuba is not a member of the World Bank. The two multilateral institutions that Africa reveres so much as solutions to her problems, politically and economically. And yet, with all that isolation and the embargo by the greatest economy in the world, the Cubans have scored successes. You may recall that in 2021, during the COVID pandemic, Cuba was able to send 200 medical doctors to Italy, a developed country. Cuba today produces its own ARVs for her people that live with HIV. The life expectancy today in Cuba is at 78, a larger figure than most third world countries, even those that pride themselves to be members of the IMF and the World Bank. The Cubans have scored unprecedented economic development in the world. But let's come closer to home. I want to speak to two countries, South Africa and Rwanda. In 1948, the National Party in South Africa won an election and formed a government which went on to establish the system of apartheid, which separated its races, the races in South Africa, or the people of South Africa according to race. It was a racist system. And most countries in the world abhorred that system. They condemned it. And in the process, many countries applied economic sanctions to the South African economy. They imposed economic sanctions for a long period of time until 1994, for many of them, when Nelson Mandela and the ANC won the democratic election of that year. During the period when South Africa lived under sanctions, the white South Africans went on to build a robust economy. They built a manufacturing industry which is unprecedented in this part of the world. And South Africa today is one of the largest exporters of agricultural products to Europe and other parts of the world. By the time South Africa was getting through the democratic election in 1994, the country was very close to producing a nuclear weapon, showing the technological advances that South Africa had achieved during this period of isolation. Again, here is a people that had suffered sanctions. Here is a people that had suffered isolation. They were like a people marooned on an island, and yet they were able to achieve what was admirable by those countries that did not live under sanctions for such a long period of time. The next interesting country is Rwanda. In 1962, Rwanda gained independence from Belgium, and Rwanda became an independent, sovereign country. The demographic structure of Rwanda is composed of 85% Hutus and the Tutsi minorities. The Tutsis had over the years suffered discrimination as a minority in Rwanda, a history which led to a war between the minority Tutsi, who predominantly lived in exile as a leadership, and those that had remained in the country. In 1994, a catastrophe happened. The plane that was carrying the president of Rwanda, who was Hutu, Juvenal Habyarimana, was shot down, and Habyarimana died in that plane crash. It triggered a catastrophe. The Hutus went on rampage to mass kill the Tutsis and the moderate Hutus who did not want to join their agenda. In 100 days, 800,000 Tutsis and Hutu moderates were killed in what is today known as the Rwanda genocide. And this happened as the world watched the genocide taking place in that small mountainous country. Rwanda, at the end of that horrific period, learned a lesson of suffering, of loss of life, and they decided as a people, Hutus and Tutsis together, to come together and find unity of purpose to construct a country that will be in the interest of everybody. In the last 30 years, Rwanda has scored major successes in economic development that we all admire today. There is a book which has been written by two scholars, and it's entitled Why Nations Fail. The two scholars Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. Why Nations Fail as a subheading of the origins of power, prosperity, and poverty. The two scholars argue and submit in the book, giving examples of England, the Civil War in 1688, the French Revolution in 1789, and the mass protests in Egypt in 2011. They argue and submit to the effect that it is the mass movements in society that bring about social and political change and put countries on a pedestal of prosperity. Now, what the two scholars have ignored in their thesis is that, in fact, the mass protests are preceded by the suffering of the people. That's what we see in England in the Civil War of 1688. We see that in France in the Revolution of 1789, which was caused by the French people not affording the price of bread. People were starving as the monarchy was living in privilege. And the French people refused to accept the spiritual definition of their suffering, that the king was doing what he was doing in the name of God, that what the king said was the word of God. The result of the French suffering were protests that brought down and obliterated the monarchy in the life of the French people, who then established a republic. So suffering precedes protests. Let me contrast this with our own situation in my country, Zambia. In 1990, during the crop season of that year, 1990-91, Zambia suffered a drought. By the time the MMD government was coming to power in October of 1991, there was a shortage of mini meal, which is a staple food in the country. But MMD enjoyed such widespread goodwill from the West, who were very happy to see the Kaunda dictatorship fall. They came to the aid of the new government. We had the experience of eating yellow maize. We didn't complain because the choice was very limited as we suffered the drought. Suffering was averted. But what it also did was that it didn't prepare us for the future. In the 2023-24 farming season, Zambia suffered another drought. The government asked the church to pray. Donors came to our aid. And as the president said, he promised the Zambian people nobody would die from hunger. Not because government had worked hard to plan, but because we are dependent on donor aid again, the complete opposite of what Lee Kuan Yew had preached to his people. As far as we are concerned, the world owes us a living. As far as we are concerned, we don't have to depend on ourselves because we can depend on others. Now, a political leadership that psychs its citizens to be overly dependent on external benevolence, the goodwill of others, cannot have the capacity to prepare its people for the calamities of the future. But this works very well for the donors. It works in their interest. It gives them the leverage to control our governance system, to decide how we should govern ourselves. After all, we depend on them. After all, they owe us a living. And hence, the situation that we are in today. History has recorded a lesson that those that endure suffering, a people that endures suffering and adverse conditions and have nobody else to look up to in the world, a people that is as good as marooned on an island, shall not perish from those conditions. Instead, that community, those people who have their survival instinct triggered, and they will surmount their problems, and they will walk on the path to prosperity. The converse is also true, that those that wish to continue depending on others, those that continue believing that the world owes them a living, cannot achieve any strides to see prosperity that would give them the pride as a people. If you've liked this video, please let me have your comments and do subscribe. Thank you very much.